And turning now to the war in Ukraine, where for the second consecutive day, cities across Ukraine have come under massive Russian bombardment. Yesterday, Russia launched its biggest air assault since the start of the war, firing off some 200 missiles and drones. And today it launched another 90 missiles, many targeting critical infrastructure in Ukraine's energy grid. In a statement, President Biden condemned the assault and reaffirmed America's commitment to Ukraine. So joining me now is retired Admiral James Stavridis, former NATO Supreme Allied Commander and NBC News Chief International Analyst. Admiral, thank you so much for joining us. We've now seen 2 days of massive Russian bombardment. So is this the strategy we should expect Russia to revert back to? And is it one that Moscow can even sustain?
We should start by observing that Putin is responding to a very successful Ukrainian invasion of Russia over the last 30 days. Let that sink in for a minute, Gabe. Russia hasn't been invaded from outside its borders since the Second World War. Ukraine is now in possession of 1,000 square kilometers of territory, 70 villages and settlements, probably 1,000 Russian prisoners. So this latest wave, this air attack aimed at the electric grid, is part of Putin responding to this invasion and showing the Russian people that he still controls a potent military.
So, Admiral, the U.S. and the West have always been concerned about Russian escalation and retaliation if we provided new weapons or allowed Ukraine to strike inside Russia. But Ukraine appears to have called Putin's bluff, right? So how does this change the dynamics of the war?
I don't think it changes significantly. And let's recall that Putin has said for 2.5 years, if Sweden and Finland join NATO, that's a red line for me. If you provide tanks to the Ukrainians, that's a red line. There have been so many Putin red lines, none of which has he actually stepped up and responded to, because he really doesn't have the kind of overwhelming military superiority he needs to do so. So my advice to the Ukrainians at this point is hold on to what you have and use it as a negotiating chip when this conflict goes to a negotiation, probably next year sometime, Gabe.
And Admiral, Politico has new reporting that during their visit to Washington later this week, top Ukrainian officials will ask the Biden administration to lift restrictions on U.S. weapons being used in Russia. And they've identified several high-value targets they can reach with U.S. missiles. So do you expect that this is just the next Ukrainian request that the administration will eventually concede and agree to? You know, I've spoken with White House officials who say they don't plan on a change in policy, but do you think that needs to happen?
I do. And there's a difference here between saying to the Ukrainians, hey, take those F-16 fighters we just gave you and send them to Moscow to attack the Kremlin. That's not what we're saying, and that's not what the Ukrainians are saying. What the Ukrainians want to do is go after targets inside Russia, to be sure, but probably within 200 or 300 miles of the Russian-Ukrainian border. I think those are entirely legitimate. We need to remember who started this, who invaded who, and under that rubric, we ought to tell the Ukrainians, go ahead and strike those Russian targets, because as you and I just discussed, Gabe, doesn't look like Putin is going to cross any red lines. I think the Ukrainians should be given release to attack targets 200 to 300 miles inside Russia.
And Admiral, on that point, President Zelensky said at a press conference today that he has a victory plan. So what do you think that really looks like? And is this a sign that he may be willing to even negotiate with Putin?
President Zelensky, like any leader of a beleaguered country, is always addressing not only his opponent, Putin, when he says, I have a military strategy. He's also addressing the people of Ukraine, trying to keep their morale high as they face mounting losses of personnel themselves. In terms of what his military strategy is, I would suspect what he wants to do is hold this chunk of territory that he has just taken from Russia and concentrate his efforts on Crimea, which is really, from Putin's perspective, the crown jewel of what he holds now. If Zelensky does those two things, I think that sets up potentially a negotiation. Whether Putin is game for one yet remains to be seen.
Admiral James Stavridis, thank you so much for your expertise, as always.